I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, oh Lord, I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, one of these days. I'm gonna be
But I think that Dr. Washington and Dr. Benson have done a wonderful job in laying out some very key points on institution building under slavery, but also during Reconstruction. So this piece today is going to focus on the age of Jim Crow. And one of the things that we do with the Hamer Institute is to get you all to thinking about ways in which you can get your students to be critical thinkers and writers, and also in their verbal expression. So one of the things that I want to do to start out, because with definitions of freedom, and Dr. Vincent made reference to Eric Foner yesterday on several occasions, and Eric Foner does a wonderful job in calling attention to the ways in which African Americans after emancipation define their freedom, because it's not this conventional definition. Because when you ask students, how do you define freedom, they typically give you the answer of doing what you want to do. Me being able to do exactly what I want to do. But this particular definition comes from the American Heritage Dictionary. First of all, the condition of being free. So that's understood. Number two, political independence. So we see it changing even in print within dictionaries. 2B, possession of civil rights. 3, ease of movement. 4, frankness or boldness. So these are all definitions that can be applied to the lives of newly freed African Americans after emancipation, but I think that it's really key that we get our students to examine the complexities of that freedom, because it's a little bit deeper than just doing what you wanted to do. There were some very specific things that African Americans wanted for their lives and their families after emancipation. So let's just engage in some dialogue on what you know already, what you've taught in your classrooms, what your responses from your students have been, if they have gone beyond saying that freedom is simply no more than just being able to do what they wanted to do, or do what you would like to do. So, definitions of freedom for newly freed people after emancipation.
Freedom of movement.
Yes. So mobility is going to be extremely important. And in moving forward, looking at these definitions of freedom are going to be some of the foundation or the key components that will aid in institution building during the age of Jim Crow. So mobility is extremely key.
I would like to say the freedom to quit your job.
The freedom to quit your job.
If I could only have one, that'd be the one I want.
Exactly, the freedom to quit your job. Because under the institution of slavery, they were not at liberty to do so unless through forms of resistance is escape. So the freedom to quit your job.
Self-reliance.
Self-reliance. And that's the other piece to it. With institution building, there are some key phrases that will come up over and over again. Self-determination, self-reliance, self-help.
The ability to define the roles of your family members and yourself.
The ability to define the role of your family member and yourself, and I think that also translates to even contributions to the household economy with wage labor. But the other piece to the family or the institution of family is the ability to be able to reclaim your family after emancipation. Yes, sir.
And although we hit on this a lot before, but we talk a lot about education.
Education is another key definition of freedom for African Americans. And of course, we know under the institution of slavery that there was this concerted effort made to keep enslaved people unlearned. But there were secret sessions that were being held, and that became extremely key in racial advancement and racial empowerment under the age of Jim Crow. Very important. And so I'm going to say this as a disclaimer. Of course, Dr. Chapman and I are not experts in these fields. I lecture on this information, and he lectures on this information, but we know what our respective areas are. So we are going to call on your support. So if you can offer up information that can help engage everyone in this discussion. But voting is going to be extremely key. And education and voting are going to be central to this discussion this morning as well as this afternoon. Any other definitions?
Freedom of religion, or to choose religion.
Okay, freedom of religion, because various denominations of the Black church are going to be extremely important. Yes, sir, and then Dr. Dillon.
Freedom from threat of violence is just absolutely central, particularly given the context of both the texts we've read today.
Freedom from the threat of violence. And Dr. Deardorff is going to cover on, she's going to cover lynching this afternoon, so that is going to be extremely important. Okay, a discussion, so be prepared for discussion.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about in terms of with family is the ability in controlling your labor, is the ability to own property, to determine when your children and where your children work, if your wife has to work, and what, you know, so there's redefinitions of masculinity and femininity and what it means to have the integrity of a family, and then plus the opportunity to own property.
So land ownership is yet another definition of freedom.
Family integrity when it comes to women. Well, men too, but.
Gender body politic. So that's going to be extremely important. And just to add a different perspective, I am going to look a lot at gender, because we see that race, class, and gender are intricately connected during the age of Jim Crow, as well as other different key points in African American history. But gender is going to be extremely important, especially when we talk about sexualized violence that is enacted upon African American women.
Well, building upon the whole defining things, but also dress, of being able to define one's own appearance of clothing, of what to wear. That was also.
The politics of respectability. This is a phrase that is coined by,
Higginbotham.
that's right, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. And when we talk about the politics of respectability, this is not just a Jim Crow era or progressive era ideology. We're talking about the politics of respectability even being transformed in different ways during the modern civil rights movement, and how people are going out and demonstrating. And of course, when the media catches hold of these people who are on the ground doing work, of course, appearance is going to be extremely important and will be noted in many instances. So dress is important. So definitions of freedom. All of these things are key for the African American community. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chapman. But today, it is about institution building and looking at ways in which African Americans work to empower the community through these institutions, but also sustain them. And I will turn it over to you, dear sir.
Thank you. So quick.
Good morning.
Good morning. Let's see. Let's take one of that. Which one is?
Advance.
So, we'll be talking about institution building in the era of Jim Crow. And as Daphne mentioned, this will be an interactive discussion. And I thought about yesterday, in the last couple of days, I've seen many of you itching to jump in, especially when we deal with Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, when it deals with mass incarceration. So I want us to have that discussion today. So this is Marcelo Plantation. This is in Mississippi. So on emancipation, the vast majority of Southern blacks were illiterate, a condition most Southern whites preferred to perpetuate. If you remember Dr. Vincent yesterday, he described this scale, and you'll see it here, the cotton scale. So why was it necessary for whites to perpetuate this system? And I jotted down some notes from trouble in my mind. Did everybody read? Really? So, no wonder, this is on page 52. No wonder the slave South had thought it critical to prevent black men and women from acquiring even the bare essentials of learning. Knowledge encouraged independence and free thought. Knowledge opened up new vistas, introduced people to a larger world than the local town and county. Knowledge permitted workers to calculate their earnings and expenditures. These were sufficient incentives for whites to maintain black illiteracy, or to place clear limits on how much knowledge blacks should acquire, and to make certain it was the right kind of knowledge imparted by the right kind of teachers. And he goes on to give an example of Henry Kirkland in Alabama. He's a worker for Jasper Clay, and his son is Emmett. It says, Emmett acquired a pretty good book learning and kept his father's books, an account of everything received from Clay. When it came to settling up time, Clay, as usual, informed Kirkland of the amount he still owed him. This time, however, the black farmer thought to question the results. Breaking with custom, by which no one challenged the white man's accounts or truthfulness, Henry Kirkland told his son to check the figures against his own account book. That act by itself infuriated Clay, he's the slave owner, or the plantation owner. He flew in a passion over that book business. He fatally shot the black farmer and seriously wounded his son. So just this notion of freedom, somebody mentioned freedom of education, freedom to learn. Just this notion of having the ability to count would cause your death in Jim Crow America. That is absolutely unimaginable to me in this day and time. And I say that because now we have to connect this to our students' reality. How will they be able to even imagine not being able to count or pretending not to count just to get by that particular day? So this new Jim Crow, just connecting it to the old Jim Crow, it's interesting because it's the theme is continuity of struggle. So how does that look for African Americans, Latinos, whites, everybody actually? But how do we use this theme to teach our students what the struggle is about, or what struggle is? So we all have our different realities, we all have our different struggles. And I was reading an article about, well, I just stumbled upon it last night, but I found it about a year ago. And in Hinds County, we were having some problems with our jail system. And they wanted to bring in a company to run the jail. So this is very problematic, because the company came in and said, we'll run your prison since you're having these problems, but you have to guarantee us one thing. You have to guarantee us 90% occupancy rate.
Oh my God.
And this was a couple of years ago. Yeah. So we're talking about Jim Crow, and we fast forward 50, 60 years. How do we engage our students when now, you know, if I'm a politician, no offense.
I'm not a politician.
Anyone?
I've never been a politician.
Okay.
A public servant.
Right.
Public servant. And
I apologize.
I really think part of the, analogy,
Mhm.
the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow, I think fundamentally with the students that we teach, I think they have to have a fundamental understanding of the old Jim Crow. I mean, and making the comparison, I mean, it sounds great. I mean, books have been written, and are being written every day, and obviously they sell well. I mean, the comparisons are real.
Right.
But on the other hand, if our students don't get a fundamental understanding of the old Jim Crow, as we move forward to talk about quote unquote the new Jim Crow, I'm not sure they appreciate that history and what the old Jim Crow meant and the impact of it. So I really think fundamentally we have to make sure that they understand what the old Jim Crow is about. And as we move forward as a people, as a country, as a nation, then they get a clearer understanding of where we are. And hopefully out of all of these discussions, at some point, we have to start talking about solutions, right? So we hope that the imaginative, creative young people, young scholars, practitioners, everybody that we have living today, that they will begin to have some impact on how do we resolve some of this crap, right? So I just think fundamentally we have to start there. Yeah, and I actually had some students sort of make the connection on their own between the old and new Jim Crow. For example, last year, 2013, I had a student from Ohio talk about his friends who didn't make it to college or he had made it to college. Because, this was in Indiana, his friend's experience was that challenging authority resulted in a bad outcome and institutionalized the criminal justice system. And that's often attracted young black men face when they go into public school systems, that when they resist or teach them to understand their behavior because they don't understand black culture, that those students get labeled as troublemakers. And then once that tag is attached to that student, then that information gets passed from teacher to teacher, grade to grade, and that's how often people are not graduating from high school. And these young kids already have an understanding that that's some kind of discrimination that still exists, and it's an obstacle for them.
Just want to jump in real quick.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to what Brother Lee was saying there. The piece is that because I live in an urban area, it's not very difficult for me to make the connection because the students suffer from stop and frisk. So what happens is when you look at numbers of stop and frisk in the urban areas that feed my institution, it's like they're very familiar with being stopped for no reason, for made-up reasons, and the like sort. So when you're going and you're talking about, well, particularly when you're talking about lynching, or most definitely when you start talking about just the misuse and the abuse of power by police, they understand that very quickly. And so then when I go back and I discuss incidences that it led to the lynching phenomenon, they make those connections very quickly. And then with economics, with the big question I always ask them is that, are they being fiscally or do they have a fiduciary responsibility? And then when they can't tell me those words, I say, see, there's already a problem. And so therefore, by introducing economics, they can understand, they can tell me about Jay-Z, and even right now, I don't think that you'll have a kid on this campus who can't tell you that Dr. Dre just became a billionaire. They know that history very quickly. Now they have to, and they'll tell you about his creativity. I think we undervalue what they know and they understand based upon their experiences. Much of the rap music that they listen to talk about the mass incarceration process. They talk about mass incarceration. So in the prison industrial system. So therefore, I actually am going to go the opposite and say, going from their own experiences and then going back to Jim Crow, now they can understand how it connects them to the past. But me trying to teach them Jim Crow first, when they can basically go and do all the freedom of movement and sit outside in places of the like sort, it's just, it fell short. But if you connect it to their own experiences, it works.
not just teaching them Jim Crow, it's teaching them their history. I mean, it's much more fundamental than that. I mean, they have to have an understanding of their history, who they are, where they came from, the struggles of their parents, their foreparents. I mean, fundamentally, if we are talking about African American history and teaching African American studies, I think we have to start with the basics. And I think it's just really important that we appreciate and understand that history, and that we teach that history to our young people. So it's not just about Jim Crow, it's about teaching this history.
And going back, let me go back to King Cotton. I think I jumped ahead a bit, and I think we should think about how we engage our students and their responses, because we come from different backgrounds. I'm in HBCU, some of you at PWIs. We are in various college settings, and we have these experiences in teaching our students. And I want you to think about some of the most challenging moments you've had in teaching race, history, Jim Crow, black codes, our history. Now, I have an example I want to start with, but let me talk about King Cotton. So, you all know, most of you know, all of you probably know more than me about King Cotton. Mississippi was one of the richest areas in the world, particularly the Delta region. Cotton was king, and that's why the white farmers wanted to cheat the sharecroppers, of course. And just moving on to I do have some examples I want to share. I brought some cotton, I'm sorry. I brought some Mississippi brown cotton. That's the brown. Some call it African cotton. And the story is, I guess I can be recorded by someone else. The person who gave it to me, I guess I can't say this. You shouldn't find that anywhere. Well, you can find it. However, you should not have original seed, right? So this is cotton that was the original seed that came across the Atlantic with enslaved Africans. So we planted some in the Mississippi soil, and it came up. So that's original. If you want some, just see me later. I'll give you a little seed, and we'll see if it comes up. But that's Mississippi cotton. That's the cotton that made billionaires out of white farmers and continued enslavement, the sharecropping and degradation of black people in Mississippi. Now, everything is dialectical. You have a positive and you have a negative. So out of this negative experience, we fought back. We wanted our own, and we started to build these independent institutions. And it started basically on the outskirts of these huge plantations, and these one-room schoolhouses. After emancipation, this is Chamberlain mine also, page 62. It says, after emancipation, the very location of the schools attested dramatically to the enthusiasm and resourcefulness of blacks seeking education. Until the state or locality could afford to build permanent structures or commitment to build them, classes might be held almost anywhere, in abandoned cabins, converted into instant schoolhouses, mule stables, billiard rooms, plantation cotton houses, warehouses and storerooms, discarded white schools, buildings owned by black fraternal orders, and most commonly in black churches. He goes on. Not all black parents eagerly shared the same passion for education. Some gave contradictory advice, wanting their children to make something of themselves by doubting the relevance of formal education. Eli Green was eager to begin school so that he could help his grandfather with accounts. So here's what his grandfather said. School don't mean anything to a end. This is his grandfather. What do they have to do except work like hell from morning till night, year in and year out, and to do what the white man tells them to do? And it don't take no education to do that. He suggested instead that his grandson emulate his grandfather, who had never been inside of a schoolhouse, but had managed to become economically independent. Make your own job, he said. Get something of your own. Don't have a boss. Be on your own. When we ends come to learn that, then we'll be somebody. So, I mean, the grandfather has a valid point. However, education did uplift enslaved Africans. And when we think about independence, we go back to this notion of freedom. And I jotted down a few things that you said. Mobility, the freedom to vote, labor, control of property, gender, respectability. And it says, the sight of blacks carrying books often had the same effect on whites as the sight of armed blacks, and many would have found no real distinction between the two threats. That kind of hostility manifested itself all too frequently in violence directed selectively at black schools, teachers, and administrators. The deliberate burning of schoolhouses, along with the harassment and murder of teachers and after emancipation and during Reconstruction, developed into a wave of terror directed at efforts to educate black children. So we build these one-room schoolhouses in efforts to become free, and there's a tax for that. We learn to read and write, there's a tax for that. So our efforts at freedom have resistance, and this resistance comes in the form of black codes. You know what black codes is. You know, you're walking down the street. And if I'm a black male and a white woman comes, of course I have to get off the sidewalk. Of course I can't bear arms. Even if I look the wrong way at a white man, that could mean death. And all this is to ultimately begin at the bottom sentence. The white terror inflicted on African people and one-time arrest of black men for minor or bogus offenses led to the proliferation of convict leasing and the beginnings of mass incarceration. So in my estimation, this is the beginning of the prison industrial complex. Before that, let's talk about this convict leasing. Please chime in at any time. I have some more artifacts. And this is what I do in class. I don't lecture, I just we go out, we visit historic sites, we go to museums, we bring in artifacts, and these are 19th century shackles. They're authentic. I'll pass them around. Please be careful with them. They're a bit rusty. Our associate dean, she'll be joining us next week on our visit. They're on loan, but those are for children. And if you look at this image, these are boys. And it just creeps me out because I have teenage boys. And to think that they could be imprisoned for 5 to 10 years for minor offenses is just, it's incredible. Well, if we think about the new Jim Crow, that still can happen. I mean, we got the Trayvon incident. I mean, the list goes on and on. David M. Oshinsky, in Worse Than Slavery, states that there was more to this system, however, than the profits it generated and the development it spurred. Convict leasing would also serve a cultural need by strengthening the walls of white supremacy as the South moved from an era of racial bondage to one of racial caste. In a region where dark skin and forced labor went hand in hand, leasing would become a functional replacement for slavery, a human bridge between the old South and the new. He goes further. The Leasing Act of 1876 was designed for black, not white convicts. The Leasing Act permitted the towns and counties to work their convicts outside the local jails. In practice, it applied to those who could not pay the fines and court costs that accompany almost every trial. The end result was a stream of black bodies to the county chain gangs and local plantations. So, this convict leasing, these beginnings of mass incarceration is a result of our learning or yearning for an education. Those one-room schoolhouses, those makeshift setups under a big tree, those just a few children carrying a book that caused alarm for the southern white plantation owners and the southern white population in general. Hence, you have, that wasn't the only reason, but hence, you have this era of convict leasing which grows and grows and grows. And soon we'll see Parchment Prison come up in Mississippi. Okay. Tobin.
Just going to note again how much worse convict leasing could be than some forms of slavery, simply because there wasn't an economic mitigation toward the treatment of the slaves, because there was no owner to lose profit by mishandling a slave. And so the death rates, I believe, were even higher in the convict leasing system than they were in many parts of mass slavery.
I was just curious, the Leasing Act that's referred to here, is that in Mississippi? That's a Mississippi
Yes.
law?
I was just gonna say the connection can be, this exact connection that you're making is very visible if you go or take your students to the website or the actual place of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And they put out a calendar every year that includes historic photographs like these with a little bit of history, but they're also doing current work that's very powerful about keeping kids out of adult prisons. And Brian Stevenson, the founder of it, has a very good TED Talk that students really, it helps.
Can you share the link with us?
Sure.
Yes.
I want to thank you for bringing that out as children, personally. But one of the things that in the illustration that when I first read it, it struck me that is that how the criminal justice system in the South was really for white people before 1865, and rapidly shifts to being almost exclusively for black people after 1865. That's a very important thing to demonstrate, that justice was handled locally on the plantation for African Americans. They rarely entered into the criminal justice system. Jails were filled with white people before 1865.
Right.
And immediately after, black men are criminalized and incarcerated as part of as exactly the bridge from slavery to Jim Crow.
Oshinsky, of course, he backs that point up. He says, as convictions mounted, southern prisons turned black.
Yep.
That's exactly what you're saying. In slavery times, a freed man recalled, jails was all built for the white folks. There weren't nobody of my color could do none of them. No time to stay in jail, they had to work. When they done wrong, they were whipped and let go. After emancipation, this pattern was reversed. By 1866, the Natchez City Jail held 67 black prisoners and just 11 whites. In Grenada to the north, there were 17 blacks and 1 white. In Columbus to the east, there were 53 blacks and no whites. Almost overnight, the jailhouse had become a Negro preserve.
I find it useful just to have students to go to the tapes or whatever tactics they use, and just have them read 13th Amendment, because it's very clear that somebody thought this out ahead of time. It's one of the versions that says that you can be enslaved if you break the law. It's very clear about that.
Slavery is out on all forms except cut forward for crime. I never used that. I appreciate it. Yeah, I use it.
The 13th Amendment is where, when Angela Davis does her work with prison reform and abolition, prison abolitionist movement, this is where they start the conversation on the 13th Amendment. And then moving into how it was then used as a sort of loophole. It is a loophole, right?
You don't even have to point it out, the kids read it and they go, look. I would like to say something too, because we were the past couple days trying to make these connections between slavery and emancipation and really pushing the civil rights movement backwards from the first time that people stepped onto the North American continent after being brought over. But with free people of color, because my work centers around free people of color, I really do argue that a lot of the blueprints were laid with the experiences of free people of color, because if you look at books like Diane Somerville Miller's work on rape of white women by black men, race and sex in the 19th century, she argues that, and other authors too, that black men were treated with disparity because of their race from the earliest times, and accused of similar crimes with white men, that their sentences would be longer, that a lot of times they were sentenced to death and that kind of thing. So I think the blueprint was laid out before, and free people of color experienced a lot of what people would find post emancipation.
And I think that's a really good point to start with the family work, because I'm going to try to touch on that a little bit later on. But even looking at some of the crimes that are being committed, because when you mention the 13th Amendment, that's clearly tied to the 15th Amendment and suffrage, and what rights are being taken away from African Americans based on some of these petty crimes that they're committing that's placing them in these systems.
Well, to go back to what you said about the Chamberlain, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Khalil Muhammad's wonderful book, The Condemnation of Blackness, in which he makes these connections. And right now, I know that we're talking in generalities, but it takes the time, because I do teach where you have different white ethnicities. He basically, for students who, his family just came over Ellis Isle, to make their connections with this process, what he does is he talks about how initially different white ethnic groups were put into categories, and how it eventually would become race. So even at this period, you still have the Irish are still, caught up in the system. You have the Chinese are going to go through the Exclusion Act in a few more years. So there's a process where how you criminalize people, and he traces the sort of how we criminalized in America and how criminalization became essentially connected to blacks. So it's a phenomenal book. And it goes back to what this process here, but he also traces about how ethnicity, how not only it's race and ethnicity, and it's powerful, his thesis.
These next shackles I pass around, please be careful. These are for children. Look how small this hoop is. So I would think, wow, I don't know, 5, 6. Looking around. So if you see these boys, going back to that earlier point, these boys should have been here. This is the schoolhouse. And Dr. Vincent talked about yesterday how African Americans, they were eager to get this education. Okay, give me a piece of bread and I go to school. The sight of blacks carrying books often had the same effect on whites as the sight of arms. That's why I just read that. kind of hostility manifested itself all too frequently in violence directed selectively as black students. Yes, I did. But the image that I have here shows you talked about yesterday was adults, teenagers, not little babies, but the age range of these African Americans in these one-room schools just was very diverse. Everybody wanted to learn how to read, to count, and these boys should have been there, but no, they're on this plantation. What does this grow into? Convict leasing. Archie. We're talking about Mississippi. This is Parchment Farm. It's up in Sunflower County. I think we'll be going. Yeah, we'll be, yeah.
We'll wake you up.
The state of Mississippi eventually moved from hiring convict labor to organizing its own convict labor camp known as Parchment Farm. It was not alone. During the decade following redemption, the convict population grew 10 times faster than the general population. Prisoners became younger and blacker, and the length of their sentences soared. It was the nation's first prison boom, and as they are today, the prisoners were disproportionately black. After a brief period of progress during Reconstruction, African Americans found themselves once again virtually defenseless. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. Even as convict leasing faded away, strategic forms of exploitation and repression emerged anew. And he cites the apparent demise of leasing prisoners seemed a harbinger of a new day, but the harsher reality of the South was that the new post-Civil War neo-slavery was evolving, not disappearing. This comes out of Michelle Alexander's review of the book.
Is this a good time for us to also talk about vagrancy laws and how they fed into the system?
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, with vagrancy laws, they could arrest you for not having a white person to vouch for you. If you didn't have an explosive job, that was a jailable offense. And so what that meant is the inability to quit where you were working because you wouldn't have a job when you left, which meant you were likely to be arrested. And it was really, like so much of this, at the discretion of the sheriff, who is the one making the profit off the labor of the convicts they're releasing. And so this is why you see things like the Chimsky talked about and others, of, 5-year-old children still from the community end up being arrested, put in jail, and used up for their labor. And so, incentive became on keeping the jails full, and laws like vagrancy laws, again, control the labor of African Americans.
Yes.
I'm sorry, does anyone know, like,
Oh, right.
when vagrancy laws were no longer enforced, because they were passed generally in 1865, and supposedly the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment overturned them. Were they enforced?
They were still in,
1870s?
they were not repealed until mid-20th century because they transitioned right into the black codes.
But the black codes were 1865.
Yeah, but the black codes also went to the 20th century. They took a couple different forms and they were different state by state.
You want to know exactly when the vagrancy laws were,
Well, vagrancy laws are part of the black codes.
right?
And at least officially, my understanding was that, they were nullified by the 14th Amendment, although, as we know, people figured out ways around the 14th Amendment in Jim Crow in the
Right.
1890s. So I'm just,
It just transitions straight through because, remember because the states weren't enforcing it, and then when the civil rights cases in 1883 were decided by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically says under the 14th Amendment, tell the states how, I mean, right, that it is private actions, right? And so what ends up happening with that period of time is if the state's not, the federal government doesn't intervene. I mean, they just let it stand.
And Tara Hunter
Yeah.
talks about this in To Join My Freedom, and she's clear that, during times of labor scarcity, the sheriff is like going to black homes and rounding up black women, even middle-class black women, and basically demanding that they work, and making it clear that there's a threat there of incarceration. So I don't know that it matters, the legal code, because in the locality, you're vulnerable.
Yeah, there's no federal oversight.
Until the Office of Civil Rights gets established, right? I mean, and even then, there's disparity in terms of what's enforced.
I think it's important to recognize as well that there were vagrancy laws in the north, right? So when I was doing my doctoral work in the late 1880s and 90s, if you were too long in Mankato, Minnesota, they would put you on a street gang and put you in forced labor until you left the town. So what happened is that in the north, in the south, the vagrancy laws and the black codes applied only to black people. And so northerners would say, well, our vagrancy laws apply to everyone, you know? And so but there was an attempt to control all kinds of labor after the Civil War by elements that wanted cheap labor. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there were vagrancy laws all over the United States that persisted throughout the 19th century. If you were in town and didn't work, they could arrest you and put you in forced labor.
And I don't think there was an argument that this was perceived as being a violation of the 14th, right? I mean, I'm sure, because the argument was they were violating, I think what's so invidious about criminal codes is that if you're violating the law, then you've given the state the ability to control your actions, your behavior, whatever. The fact that the law itself is targeted over certain populations you're trying to control is moot. As the federal government is looking at it at that time. So, it wouldn't necessarily be seen as a violation of civil rights. We look at it today and say, how could it be anything else? And of course, the people it was being applied to would see it. But I think the way that the courts and the federal structure was seeing it, these were people who violated the law and there were consequences for it. So there were exceptions within the 13th and 14th Amendment to that because they were given due process. They broke the law. There was some kind of trial of some sort. And
Not all.
no, of course not. No, but there was a structure in place. Of course we can look at lots and lots of. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying, but I think that's how the federal government was understanding it at the time.
I think they're looking like, what law y'all talking about? What law? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think then that we have to add to the list that Daphne asked us to begin with about freedom. So maybe then we have to think about freedom of public leisure, right? So if there's this insistence, right, that black bodies always be in motion, in labor, right? So that it becomes criminal to sit still, to just lean against the side of the store, or to just sit, right? So that then the desire had to have also been, right, to not just movement and autonomy, but leisure, public leisure.
Right, 8 hours for what we will.
Absolutely.
Well, I did some research a number of years ago, and I was looking at criminal law as enforced, and this was in the late 20th century. And in Chicago, 73% of people who were arrested for loitering were African American. And so, I think those were those ambivalent kinds of legal requirements, like loitering. Who's loitering? Who's waiting?
Yeah.
These
Who's
are
just chilling? Can
Right.
I just relax and not
who's waiting for a bus and who's loitering? Those are perceptions.
in public spaces?
I think this goes back to what Charles Payne said at the very beginning, that we don't even have a knowledge of the labor movement now. So the 8-hour day, the idea that anybody could go from waking up to working to leisure was a very contested idea until, 70 years ago. And I think we're moving back, inching back toward this notion of public leisure as somehow being inappropriate, except for very rich people.
Right, which is why they were called the leisure class.
spite of all this, walking down the street with a book, you could lose your life. Having your one-room schoolhouse burned down. Being arrested in mass. In spite of all this, we still have independent Black-controlled schools. And this is where Daphne will pick up a short clip. But we have Youth of Normal Industrial Institute, established 1903. Greenwich Normal Industrial Institute, established 1907. And Piney Woods Country Life School, established in 1909. Piney Woods still exists. Now, this is, I'm just going to read a few more things. Mississippi spent next to nothing on Negro education, you know that. Black children, comprising 3/5 of the state's school-age population in 1900, received less than 1/5 of the school funds, yet James Barnum, the governor, opposed all such spending on the grounds that it undermined the Negro's God-given role as a servant to the white. Although blacks comprised the majority of the population of Mississippi, no state gave less to black education between 1890 and World War II. At the turn of the century, blacks in Mississippi made up 60% of school-aged children, but they received only 19% of state's school funds. The state superintendent of education acknowledged in 1899 that the public school system had been designed primarily for the welfare of white children in the state, and incidentally for the Negro children. And with this is a Mississippi politician, not public servant. It is money thrown away in 1899, alleging that education simply implanted in blacks aspirations and ambitions whites would never permit them to gratify. The environment in which black schools tried to survive helps to explain some of the toadyism of administrators and peers and self-doubts of teachers and students. To survive financially and politically, it was necessary to be aware of and meet the expectations of whites, to allay their deep concerns about the subversive effects of black education. And Lawrence Jones, he's the founder of Piney Woods, and it's a story in Chamberlain Mine on page 86. The argument says Lawrence Jones, for example, wanted to convince the public that his Piney Woods school in Mississippi would make more efficient laborers of his students. The argument found ready acceptance among local whites. He says he ain't gonna teach them so much book learning, said this much relieved sawmill operator. But he wants to learn them to do more and better work. So when he wants a good end like him, so when we want a good end like him, they're saying they like Lawrence Jones. So Lawrence Jones, here's the story. Lawrence Jones was found in, please correct me, Dr. McLemore, I know you know the story. Lawrence Jones he was found in the woods of Mississippi, and he had a noose around his neck. And that's when he began to explain that he wanted to start a school to keep ends from messing up white folks' property, messing up white folks' schools. So I want to create a school that's separate and we can do our own thing, basically. Did I get it right now? Yeah. So he had the noose around his neck, and he was able to convince them to take the noose off so he can start this school. And it still exists today. So some they call Lawrence Jones what? Set out? No. Uncle Tom? No.
Entrepreneur.
Yes. 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 Nation builder, yes. Yes. Practical. So through all of these trials and tribulations, we still survive, we still build institutions even in the midst of, we've been talking about trauma a lot, and of course this is trauma. But despite the odds, we survived. Daphne, show the clip now, buddy.
And before showing this clip, it is on Mount Bayou. I want to give some more information to Utica Junior College, because you all heard Dr. Benson mention it over and over again. But that is, that's what came after Utica Normal and Industrial Institute. And in 1903, Utica Normal and Industrial Institute was founded by William Holtz Claw, and his family is still very prominent here in this area. And what's interesting to it, and I talked about the fact that we want our students to see themselves in the history that we teach them. And we want them to be able to embrace that history and be empowered by that history. Well, in 1970, a young lady by the name of Jean Diane Kelly wrote a paper on Utica Junior College and its history. And what she noted was the progress that was being made because African American students were getting a quality education there. And this young person, who was an English major, ended up going on and transferring to Toulouse College. And that young person is my mother, and we found her paper a couple of months ago as we were going through my grandmother's stuff. So just to show you how much of an impact institutions have on young people, and when they understand the historical significance of those spaces, it makes it really special. But to bring it to the present, one of the things I shared with Dr. Benson yesterday is that 2 Fridays ago, Hines AHS, which was formerly known as Utica High School, on that particular campus was closed. It had its last official day of school. So at the same time, we're talking about institutions that have been sustained over the years and extremely powerful in making an impact on an entire community of people. But at the same time, if there's not enough protest, not enough resistance to what's going on in contemporary times, these institutions can be threatened and closed. So that's just some information on that particular school. But
Can I mention about Piney-Woods, just a personal story? Piney-Woods, it's my understanding, is the only school, boarding school for African Americans. I know, isn't it in North America? Isn't it the only boarding school
No, I think
in this area?
well, in this area, but I think there are, Pineywood is one of, I think, 3 that's still left,
Yeah.
historically black boarding schools.
Because let me tell you,
In the country, yeah.
in the country, that's what I'm saying, in the country, and what happens is, here's a story about JSU. Glenn Andrews was from California, having some issues. He ended up going to Pineywood and from California, and then he ended up graduating from Pineywood, and he came to Jackson State, and he got his undergraduate and his master's degree from this area, from JSU, and that was my boyfriend throughout my undergraduate, and I always associate Pineywood with what it did in his life, and then what Jackson State did in his life. So we were saying the power of changing. He was in California, and he was in San Francisco, and unfortunately, his brother did not have the same story. His brother died by the age of 26 because of street fight. So there was a difference, a tale of 2 brothers.
We have a strong Piney-Woods contingent here at JSU, and some of my best students come out of Piney-Woods. They have a strong international student base.
Yes.
They have a lot of, students from all over, but here at JSU, we have a lot of Ethiopians. They go to Piney-Woods and come to Jackson State, and they're just dynamic students.
okay, so with Mount Bayou, we're talking about 1887, and this is going to be the quintessential black community that is formed, even under this veil of segregation. So of course in 1903 with the Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this veil and how African Americans are extremely resourceful and creative in forming lives for themselves despite these racial boundaries that have been put in place by them. And the person or the mastermind behind the foundation of, or the establishment of Mount Bayou is going to be Isaiah T. Montgomery. And this is a very complex individual, and we will talk about him a little bit later, but just to understand the depths of institution building during this particular era, we want to show you this clip, and then we will take a break after this.
But in the sea of violence, there were islands of hope. One was in the Mississippi Delta, a town called Mound Bayou.
There was no other place for me other than Mount Bayou. To me, it was the greatest place around. People could, we have our own offices. I didn't have to walk down the street afraid.
This was something was unbelievable in this very racial conscious era, where there was so few opportunities other than manual labor for black people.
We had everything in Mount Bayou that art could desire. We had oil mills, we had stores, we had bottle works, we had hospitals, we had zoos, we had swimming pools. We had a lot of things that people would enjoy.
Mound Bayou was founded in 1887 by black businessman Isaiah T. Montgomery, a southern man with a simple philosophy. It's a white man's country. Let them run it.
Isaiah Montgomery is a true American, and in a sense he was extraordinarily opportunistic. Isaiah Montgomery had the ability to identify those individuals who had goods and services and political power and esteem in the community and ingratiate himself with those persons.
Following the lead of men like Pap Singleton, Montgomery planned to create a safe harbor for blacks.
It was not easy to find settlers in the early days. The task of clearing the wild country seemed hopeless to men with so few resources and so little experience. Isaiah Montgomery.
The Delta of Mississippi in the mid-1880s was nothing more than a wilderness. These black people who came to the Mount Bayou area had to cut down trees, had to drain bayous, had to build up the land, had to fight off wild animals and snakes, and they lived as frontiersmen lived throughout the world.
Day by day, a town began to take shape. Churches, the post office, and schools replaced the forest.
My grandmother was Ada Simmons. She came here from Virginia. She wanted other than what she had been doing, the slavery, and the people telling them what to do. She had in her mind that there must be something else. There must be something that was, better than what she was living under.
Unlike some black communities, the whites did not come in and destroy the community like some instances of other black communities. I believe because there was a notion that a separation of the races was an answer to the race problem.
By 1890, Mound Bayou was on its way to becoming one of the most prosperous black communities in the country. The jewel of the Delta, as it would later be called. That year, Mississippi assembled a convention to pass its new Jim Crow Constitution. The only black delegate was Isaiah T. Montgomery.
Black people.
And we will talk about the Mississippi Constitutional Convention of 1890 after lunch. So, but I just wanted you all to get a sense of what one town here in Mississippi was like, and some of the institutions that were created within that particular town to form a cohesive black community that would be found all across the American South. So, Dr. McLemore, I'm going to pull up. Dr. McLemore, ladies and gentlemen, it's 10:10. So if you would please return at 10:20 and we will get started again. institutions shape and reflect African American identity. And that's going to be extremely important because the second part of this session, I'm going to look a lot at the people who made these institutions and the plans that they put in place to sustain these institutions, primarily through educating children. The third question, how does an examination of gender enhance narratives of struggle and resistance during Jim Crow? But this also even goes into the modern civil rights movement, and especially where class is concerned and middle-class African-American women and the power that they're wielding within their respective communities. And last but not least, how does institution building help us contextualize Black resistance and oppression during the Jim Crow era? So these are some questions for you all to think about and help answer during this session, but also questions that you can take back to your classrooms to get your students to think deeper about what's going on during the Jim Crow era. Now, Rico did a wonderful job in pulling out the fact that there are parallel institutions, and I'll get to that. Engaged in resisting oppression and inhumane treatment of an entire race of people through both conventional and unconventional forms of protest. With the top image, this again is one of those protest demonstrations in support of the anti-lynching campaign, but another form of resistance to address issues of lack of health care or access to health care in the Mississippi Delta through the efforts of the sorority across the bottom. But other unconventional forms, of course, came in fundraising, marches, of course, and social welfare programs. But these women right here would have a wonderful group of successors, let me say that. And because I want to tie it to the Black middle class during the modern civil rights movement. And this brings us to 1961 with the formation of the organization Woman Power Unlimited. And I made mention of the fact that one of the Hanger Institute's core faculty members, T. Morris, has a book that will be coming out this fall through the University of Georgia Press on this support organization. And this is a middle-class women's organization of Black women here in Jackson. They're business owners. They are wives of some of the most prominent civil rights supporters and leaders within this community. And as you can see, these women adhere to the politics of respectability. With the gloves and all. But to add to that piece, Wednesdays in Mississippi is really important because these members of Woman Power Unlimited also contributed to those Wednesdays in Mississippi, and they were more than just white gloves. These were women who were on the ground supporting the efforts of the civil rights movement, particularly during 1964 with Freedom Summer. With that said, I'm very happy and proud to know T because she is one of those scholars who's rescuing these women from obscurity and showing that Black middle-class women are doing some very interesting work within their communities. But at the same time, when you all hear from me again next week, we will talk about this paradigm shift within the Black middle class, particularly in Birmingham, Alabama. Because we're talking about these women right here on the ground in Jackson who are supporting the movement, but there are going to be some very different takes on civil rights activism in Birmingham. So, yes?
Is there something happening on June 24th? In the evening?
Yes. And I guess that's a wonderful announcement. Since you all will be here on the campus at 6 p.m. in this building in the Student Center Theater, there is going to be a panel discussion of Wednesdays in Mississippi. There's currently a documentary that is being put together. We will show maybe a 10 to 15 minute clip of that documentary, and also members, former members of WIMS will be a part of that panel. And you will have the opportunity to meet T. Morris. who will be a part of that panel. So that is Tuesday, June 24th at 6 p.m. in this building in the theater room.
And it's probably worth noting that the woman on the left, the black dress without gloves, is Clarice Collins Harvey, who was the leader and one of the founders of this group of Women's Power Unlimited. And just by chance, she was chairman of the board of trustees at Russ College.
Dr. Mackle will never surprise.
I just want to point that out. I'm sure no one knew that but me. But everybody know that. Thank you, Mom.
So in closing, Dr. Chapman and I, you all saw the questions before, perhaps we can end in just an open discussion on how we can engage students in answering these questions, or how we can push students to meeting our expectations in analyzing, critiquing this history in various ways. But yeah, those are the questions for thought, but also maybe to take back. But how do we plan on engaging our students with the information that has been presented, not just today, but over the past couple of days? Because there are some themes that have that are connecting all of these talks and these discussions. Here.
I talked to Jolie and I were talking. I think I talked to Katie about this too. But I mean, literally using and other people, but just using the narratives, and in particular, being very intentional about which narratives we're using. Charles Payne was talking about this, but if we are more kind of creative in what stories we're putting in front of students, then it not only challenges kind of what they've been taught or not taught, but it also opens them up to hear things that they might not have been so ready to hear.
And I think that's really interesting you bring that point up. The first time I assigned Trouble in Mind was at the University of Mississippi, and listening at students' responses to having read that book. A lot of them were like, this is a very depressing book. We have to tell the truth about history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so with that said, it's a very convicting book. And I think that was one of the things that my students were really confronted with, in having read some of the narratives found within that book. But, in understanding history, in understanding our own personal views, we have to understand that those personal views are shaped by history.
Yeah, and I think that, as someone who teaches, my classes are mixed, but the student body at Bowling Green is still probably 75% white in a lot of the classes I teach. And I think one of the things that, encountering sort of historical narrative first, sometimes I'll teach things like James Baldwin, a lot of times, things like that, and there are those white students who are like, it's so angry, why is it angry? For very good reason, right? And so I think putting in dialogue the history and the fiction, or the history and the essays and things, sort of makes that, oh yes, of course, this makes perfect sense. They really reinforce each other.
I was just going to say, as far as you were just talking about some of these disturbing histories, these depressing narratives and that kind of thing, and Dr. McLemore, you were saying that students really need to have a good grounding in the Jim Crow period to see how different, even though we can make these comparisons, how different that time period was. And maybe this question might be out of place right now, because if we're planning on going into a discussion of lynching, I guess I'll hold off until then. But I am just really curious to see how people, everybody, or as many people that want to help me with this, how we frame lynching, because I'm one of those people that really do think that we shouldn't sugarcoat things. And there's been some pieces out there in some of the scholarly journals about students getting upset by history and trauma and all, But I think it's really important that we don't forget these kinds of episodes. And I was horrified when last year I assigned just an article about lynching, and so many of my students had never even heard of lynching, which I found to be completely unbelievable. But I'm just wondering, with the images, you showed some really powerful images. what do you guys think? Because there's an accusation of, looking at these lynching photographs like Beyond Sanctuary and those kinds of pictures that are warehouse, you run the risk of voyeurism. Without sanctuary, what did I say? Okay. I'm sorry. But, these images are really disturbing to students, and I'm just curious how people teach lynching if you do use some of these images, what exactly, how you handle it. Because I struggle with this. Sometimes I will teach it and provide these kinds of images. Sometimes I'll tell the students to look at it on their own. But when you do that, you always run the risk of students just kind of forgetting about it when they leave your classroom. So
We are going to talk about that.
Okay.
Well, a quick comment, I guess, a segue to my point about what we did today and talking about what Rose is, trying to answer the questions, but just kind of restart us off. But for me, I've done a lot of reading about the convict policing and everything. We see the documentaries. I've done all that. But when I touched the chains from the chat, I won't talk about it because it just touched so much inside me. But the way you presented that to us, there was, I don't know about you all, there was so much happening it was such a multi-dimensional experience. And so I never do a lot with actual artifacts. And so I do a lot of multimedia stuff and have students do things with that, but definitely understanding how maybe like a piece of an actual rope, teaching lynching or something, could be an impactful way to say so much and have them be students engaged without verbalizing as much and causing a kind of flood in the class of emotional takeover.
And that goes back to what Deborah mentioned in our introductions at Smith Robertson. It's the emotional piece. You don't always have to verbalize it, but because the change for the children, that did something to me. So we're understanding that the horrors of slavery, children weren't exempt from that. The horrors of Jim Crow, children weren't exempt from that. The violence that came as a part of youth activism and the civil rights movement, children were not exempt from that. So the experience, being able to actually physically touch it, it does something else. It takes you to another place, and it really does help you to better understand that, somebody wore these. And then not just somebody my age, but someone much younger than I who had to be, go through this, that did something to me too.
Yeah, with the three-dimensional objects, it's hard to forget the experience as opposed to the written word, even though words are very powerful. Having something to hold or going to a historic site, just experiencing a three-dimensional object has another dynamic to it. And I wanted us to think about how we teach, and of course you're doing that. I had this experience. I was teaching the transatlantic slave trade, and of course we're here at Jackson State. It's an HBCU, so our classes are 90 to 95% African American. So this one particular class, it was African history, and we had shown film, we had these discussions, and it was just intense. And I had one white student, and there was a young lady, young African American woman, and she had basically come to tears. She was angry. So you go through these stages of consciousness, right? Once you find out some new information, the first stage is anger. You go through being angry for, I don't know, months or something. But anyway, she was so angry that she blurted out, and I guess I can say it because it's not me, and I don't believe it. So she said, if there was a hell, all white people would be in it. After this experience of the film, the discussions, the artifacts. So for this young white woman who was in the class, she got up and she just burst into tears and stormed out, never to return again. So, I mean, how do you control that? I can't, I don't know how, but that did not deter me from bringing in artifacts, showing film, showing photographs, because it's a painful process, but it's also a healing process. I do see the student, and she's fine now, both of them, and the young African-American woman, she's no longer angry. No, she's going through her anger moment. And the young white woman, she's fine. You know, it's all good now. But I guess that had to happen. Was it good? I don't know. Was it bad? I don't know. It is, you know, it's the same, it is what it is.
I had a similar, not the same, almost the opposite. I was teaching, I taught a course when I was at Millikan, which was dominantly white. And I would teach a course on civil rights in the U.S., and we used lynching as a form of oppression and the various means of resistance people used throughout 19th and 20th century. And I'll talk about some of that later on this afternoon. But I had a student, and one of the things we did in reading Ivy Wells' The Red Record, there's a reference to a lynching in the community where we work, which was Decatur, Illinois. And the students, as they were reading, all their eyes caught on that. And so they began investigating, and I ended up with the archival, you know, the letters, the stories from the newspaper. And so we've been talking about, this is several classes after I realized that this was really exciting for them in a weird kind of intellectual way, that this was home where this occurred. Well, I had a young man who in the middle of class suddenly realized what a family souvenir actually was. And came to understand that the finger that had been in his family, that was just something that was there, that he had never connected to a human being, and now knew the man's name, now knew where he came from, and all of a sudden had to start rethinking, what does this mean about mom and dad? What does this mean about grandma and grandpa? What does this mean about the family I lived in and my understanding of who these people are? And I've seen students explode in class, but I've never seen one really implode. I mean, just fell apart. And what was interesting is this was a fairly racially diverse class. I didn't do anything. They did. I mean, they surrounded this young man. They talked him through it. And it was something to see. And so some of it is kind of, I think, the community that ends up in the classroom as they kind of walk through these things together. I have to say the hardest time I had was when I only had one African-American student in the class. And before the class began, he and I had a long talk about it. We set up support for him elsewhere that he knew he could go to, and to kind of walk through this together in light of having anger and not a community to express it. You can't do it.
I just wanted to try to connect the dots, because I teach race in the United States, and you know, there are things that are going to be more sensitive to some than they are to others, and I just wanted to kind of explicate the examples that you all gave. And I think the take-home message or the take-away message is that we really have to work to build communities in our classrooms, so that the students in our class have an understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish. Now, that doesn't change people's reactions, because they are individuals and they have the right to express their emotions and feelings. But I think it's imperative as educators, as people who are trying to educate others, that we build a particular community so that people feel connected, even if you're the only one, even if there's a small population, even if this example or text or visual that I'm going to use could be potentially elicit particularly motives. And so I think we really need to think about that on the front end of our classes. How do we plan on building community in our class so that students understand that there is something that kind of as people share today, that you need to get out. You can get it out. Because I think that the learning is inhibited by people who feel like they couldn't say it in class and they want to come talk to you one-on-one. That may have been something that other people in the class needed to hear. And so we have to just really be conscientious of that and really be very intentional. I just want to say thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I want to say two things. One, just in terms of working with the students from the beginning, saying to them that there may be things that come up in this class that touch you really deeply and things that you haven't thought about before. And when those things come up, to encourage them to sit with them, rather than to run away from them or to blurt out, but just sit with them for a while and figure out, why am I feeling like this? You know, what's touching these feelings? Why am I feeling like this? And then also building into class that time where people can talk and talk honestly about how they're feeling, I think is also really important. The second thing I want to touch on is just the idea of institutions. And we talked a lot about education, churches, prison system. What about banking? How did Black folks manage banking during this period? Finances of any kind during this period? And how did that also help to build the Black community? And how is that connected to the way banking is still done today and has been done through the years? I mean, when I think about institutions, literally every institution in this country has been affected by racism. And how do we help students to see the bigger picture around that? I think this is a really good start, but I don't think it's enough in terms of really talking about.
Just please make sure you read the 3 chapters from Black Maverick that talks about Dr. T.R.M. Mason Howard. Just please look at those chapters. There's some discussion of banking, entrepreneurship, and all these things that some of the things you just mentioned. Yeah, that's real possible.
Right now, we are on New York bestseller list. Maya Angelou, I Know by the Cage Bird Sings. And then the second book, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read it, it's called One Nation by Ben Carson. So the 2 books right now, the top 2 books in the New York Times list are African American. And it reaches a discourse where when we look at African American history, we sort of have to look at. Maya Angelou is talking about her story and the harshness of growing up in the South. Ben Carson is talking about the empowerment of growing up in America. And one of the pieces of the criticism that have come out of not striking that balance is that history is making victims of African Americans today, especially in areas where students are already growing up with a sense of hopelessness, and then they get into a classroom and they learn basically they learn a narrative that is constantly telling them about their marginalization. So this conversation is essential because in essence, I think the 2 New York bestseller lists reveals 2 ideologies in America, particularly about where America is going, and specifically about where African Americans are going. In the sense that you have a cadre of African Americans, especially those who are ascribing to libertarian thoughts, that yes, this was our history, but now we have to go on and not create a victim by telling them about all the oppression that they face and how they've been marginalized from the narrative. And then you have another group that says, well, we have to teach them the history so they learn how to appreciate it. So it's this balance that has to be, it's a fine line because because of teaching students, I'm the only Black in most of my class. So when you're teaching Black students, when they do come to my class, the African American history class, when they are there, I know I have to walk a very fine line because they're coming from an urban area, whereas, they have really come from the ranks. And it's a very fine line. You have to have a very fine line there. It's very fine because you can tip the scales in one way. Instead of empowering, you can now foster this idea that we're still constant victims of racism.
I agree, Tanya. I really do. It's a difficult thing to walk, and you can feel the class turning in front of you. And that's why, Daphne, I wrote down what you said. Oppression makes action. And never talk about slavery without talking about resistance in the same day. Never let it pass by. Don't leave them with those feelings of frustration without giving them models of people fighting. And that is something that you have to be so conscious of, because you can actually feel them just becoming so frustrated and angry. So I agree. I think you have got to be, and not just in the class overall, but on a daily basis. Is that really balanced? And not like, even Stephen in any way, but giving them voices that they can identify with. I just have one question, just really quickly. Something that I read in the reading, and Deborah kind of lighted my way on this one, like with the banking question. Macmillan is talking about the Garveyites, and I am still so curious. Does anybody know if anybody is working on UNIA chapters in the South? Because it comes up again. You see references to this all of the time. Rosa Parks' grandfather is a Garveyite. Does anybody know if the scholar is working on UNIA stuff? Barry?
There was a young lady at Georgia State who did a dissertation on Garvey in Georgia. I can't remember her name right now, but there are some people doing that.
One of my
I have a colleague also,
Dan Dalrymple.
he wrote a manuscript on the UNIA in Louisiana. So that's a dissertation.
And it's also published in book form too.
And you all have exemplified for us how to have conversations where we strike a balance of discussing oppression and resistance, and how Black people basically, as we learned on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, still build institutions.
So that's the whole point of the seminar, right? Is that it's built around struggle and institution building and power. And I don't, and violence, but I just say in my class, the hardest thing for me to do, so I don't let them write on oppression. Every week they write on struggle and institution building. And if they write on oppression, I hand it back and say, you're writing about white people, not Black people. It's a Black history class. So you can take a white history class and write about oppression, but in a Black history class, we write about overcoming oppression. So I just hand it back and make them write it over again. And I said, you can write on oppression, but after you've written your 2 paragraphs on struggle and institution building, right? So I think there's a way to say, and that's different than a race relations class. So in a race relations class, that's different. But I said, and I teach an African American history class. In African American history class, we study Black people, not white people. And you're writing about white people. And when you have, there's a question, whatever, when you're teaching white people, they cannot write about Black people. I mean, it takes almost half the class to get them to write about Black people. But we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, and I do the same thing, and that's why I signed Vincent Harding, because Vincent Harding starts it with resisting on the shores of Africa, and that African American history is American history, and that if you're not focusing on the struggle, you got it all wrong. And it solves the problem. It makes it an awesome, positive class instead of a drudge fest. It's wonderful.
Nicole, you mentioned, I'm going back to something you asked about in terms of how people teach lynching, et cetera. And I would like to go back to even the clip that we saw, the visual, where there were 2 men up front and then the rest of the people who were protesting were female. A couple of reminders from my perspective is that even with the institution building during this period, there were the manifest effects and then there were the latent effects. And I think for me, even in that visual, the women represent not so much a political statement of that time, but the empathy that comes with someone's son being lynched. All of, just from a gender standpoint, every woman can relate to that. And, I'm out here maybe for political reasons, but more I'm supporting you because this is your son that has been lynched. And while we talk about, now we know all about support groups, But then during the institution building, there might not have been people who came and said, I want to help you get through this or that or whatever. But one of the latent effects were the building, latent effects were whatever. The building of, I can't get that one right, was the building of these various support groups that came mostly from females as opposed to males. Do y'all get it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that was smart.
That's